So now we're going to add another level of complexity. The problem is going to be a little bit trickier. So here we're going to suppose that 10% of people in some population use a certain steroid. Let's say this is Olympic athletes or something. And if you use the steroid, the test says you use the steroid 80% of the time. So it gives 80% true positives. But it's not 80% accurate for negatives. If you don't use the steroid, the test says you don't use the steroid only 70% of the time. So it only misses 20% of the positives, but it gives you 30% false positives. Now, suppose 1,000 people take the test. How many of them are actually going to be steroid users? Well, we said 10% of people use the steroid, so 1,000 people take the test, it's going to be 10% of 1,000. For the 900 who don't use the steroid, how many of them will test positive? Well, if you don't use, the test says you don't use 70% of the time, which means if you don't use, the test says you do use 30% of the time. So 30% of that 900 are still going to test positive. So that's 270. For the 100 who use the steroid, how many will test positive? Well, if you do use it, it says you use it 80% of the time, so it's going to get 80 of those 100 people using the steroid. How many total positives? Well, it's going to be the positives that you get from the non-users and the positives you get from the users added together, and that was 270 and 80, so it's going to be 350. What's the probability you use steroids if you test positive? Well, it's just the total number of people who actually use from that group, which is 80 out of 350. So let's just go through. How many of them will use the steroid? 10% of 1,000 equals 100. For the 900 who don't use, how many are going to test positive? Well, 30% of that 900, because if you don't use, it's 70% accurate, which means 30% inaccurate. So it's going to give 30% false positives. That's going to be 270 because 30% of 900 is 270. For the 100 who use, how many test positive? Well, for the 100 who use, you're going to catch 80% of them because if you use, it catches you 80% of the time. So 80. Total positives is just that 270 plus the 80. And 80 of those are guilty, so 80 out of 350, which is approximately, sorry, that just means approximately 23%. Okay. Here's another example that has the same form. Mrs. 90% is 90% accurate in judging color. Suppose she judges a cab to be green. What are the odds the cab is green? Well, suppose she sees 10 cabs on a given night. 9 of them are blue. Here they are. How many of those blue cabs is she going to say are green? Well, approximately 1, right? Because she's 90% accurate. So 1 of those cabs is green. Here's the green one. How many of these green ones is she going to say are green? Well, approximately 1, because it's green. She gets things right 90% of the time, so she's probably going to get it right. So how many total times will she say green? She'll say green for the one that is green, and she'll also say green once for the ones that are blue. So 2 total times. How many of them are actually green? Well, it's 1. So what are the odds she's right if she says a cab is green? Well, 50%, 1/2.